The Royal Air Force is one of the oldest independent air forces in existence, having been created in 1918 out of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Navy Air Service. Today we will have a look at how World War I profoundly shaped the RAF even before its creation, and how this affected its doctrine as far as World War II. During World War I, the British Army and the Royal Navy were in command of an auxiliary air service. The Army had the Royal Flying Corps, the Royal Navy the Royal Navy Air Service. Both services were used to support their specific branch, with the Royal Flying Corps soon taking up operations along the front lines held by British troops. Here, the initial use of air power was as everywhere on the front lines, and mainly for reconnaissance and smaller tactical strikes. In 1916 this changed. Already at the Battle of Verdun, between German and French troops, a new dimension of air power was making its mark, the fighter aircraft. Soon, and especially at the Battle of the Somme, the Royal Flying Corps set up their own dedicated fighter squadrons. With the passage of time came also more powerful machines and sophisticated equipment. Soon planes were able to carry more and bigger bombs, drastically increasing the capability of the air service. Seeing as the army was fighting a murderous battle on the ground, the role of the Royal Flying Corps was increasingly that of a supporting weapon. In the army's mind, planes were a tactical tool, useful only in a direct application against frontline or near frontline enemy troops. Flying far into the enemy hinterland was considered to be nothing more but a wasted mission and a wasted plane that could have been used elsewhere. The Navy, on the other hand, not embroiled in any land battle, had other avenues to explore, and was out looking for trouble. Royal Navy Air Service strategic bombing was employed against German targets in airship pens between 1914 and 1915, far away from the front lines. The overall impact is debatable, but in 1916, the Royal Navy Air Service began to target the Saar Valley industry, but never attained the necessary strength to inflict significant and lasting damage. The army wasn't exactly pleased about this and saw it as a waste of resources. In their mind, planes should provide direct tactical assistance for troops on the front lines. In the end, the army got its way, and most strategic operations were put on hold until 1918. This was not the end of the story, however. While the army had won the internal battle in the short run, there was one thing it had not foreseen: the German Gotha raids on London in 1917. The result of these was that public and political sentiment began to increasingly affect military strategy. Revenge was a potent argument, and while with the Zeppelin raids most Brits had reserved their anger towards their own government, now they turned on the Germans. At the same time, an increase in the availability of planes allowed for a resumption of a number of strategic missions. Yet, there was no immediate change in doctrine. By October 1917, a small detachment of single-engine aircraft had been set up in France with the specific intent to fly reprisal sorties. While this calmed public sentiment in Britain, the French were not pleased, arguing that such a move would evoke a German response, certainly aimed at French cities. Largely unsuited for the operation, the planes failed to make a concrete impact. By May 1918, this small detachment was disbanded, but the experiences were submitted to London, stating that the inflicted material damage was marginal, but optimistically arguing that the moral effect on the enemy had been devastating. There was little evidence at the time to suggest that it had been, and this opinion was largely based on the assumption that it must have been frightening. Let us backtrack a little bit though, and have a look at the Royal Air Force, now created by fusing the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Navy Air Service. It was still internally divided on the subject of strategic bombing. While some maintained that targeting civilians was objectionable on moral grounds, the debate largely revolved around what military justification there was for such attacks. Those arguing against strategic bombardment maintained the attitude of the former Royal Flying Corps, seeing such operations as self-sabotaging behavior, robbing the British Army of frontline support. Nevertheless, some leadership changes set the tone for the future. What follows is a simplified account of two of the key changes. Hugh Trenchard, the commander of the Royal Flying Corps from 1915 to 1917, had been a strong opponent of strategic bomber operations. When the Royal Air Force was set up, he made way for Frederick Sykes, who was more open to the idea of sending bombers against factories and civilians. Ironically, Trenchard was offered command of Royal Air Force strategic bomber operations under the independent force. Being pragmatic and currently out of a job, he accepted. Although formally opposed, Trenchard began to change his mind on strategic bombing. Already in 1917, some private memos revealed that he had started to develop a fleeting interest in such operations, but now that it was under his direct command, he relinquished his former reservations. Indeed, by the interwar years, Trenchard became an outspoken and public advocate of strategic bombing.
Strategic bombing, you say? Well, it seems I came by at the right time.
Who are you and how did you penetrate my secret bunker? Alarm!
I'm Indy Nidell from the Great War Channel. You might know us from YouTube. We are the #1 channel when it comes to World War I history.
Oh yeah, Indy, what brings you here today?
Well, I heard that you'd be making a special on British strategic bombing during World War I, and thought I'd mention that we too have made a similar video.
Oh, what a coincidence. Tell me more.
Now, you're focusing a lot on the British here, but as you know, strategic bombing was not a uniquely British thing, so we thought we'd shed some light on the general bombing trends during World War I. For example, we'll also talk about some of the French and German tactics, how they differed, and how it affected World War I as a whole.
Fantastic. Listen, I will link my aces to your video in the description, so they all get to benefit from your wisdom.
Sounds good.
Sehr schön. Now, get out of my bunker.
Oh, how do I get out?
Well, down the hall, left, then right, left again, left, straight till the end. Now the door is a bit stiff, you might want to give it a nudge.
Alright, I'll be on my way then.
Alright then. Well, yes, so politicians at the time had also been pressured by public sentiment and an outspoken media to continue with more reprisal raids. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, even anticipated that in 1919 the R.A.F. would be able to launch continuous raids on German towns. Numerous think pieces, mostly by military theorists, supported an expanded and dedicated strategic bomber force. Yet, while rhetoric was one thing, reality was another. British intelligence and post-war reports confirmed that material damage was insignificant, but maintained, although failing to give concrete evidence, that the moral impact was substantial. It was on this rhetorical basis that most advocates pressed for more long-range bombing. The post-war reports, laden with ambiguity and little actual proof of the severity of the moral effect, did not prevent the R.A.F. to discount strategic bombing in the interwar years. Instead, the R.A.F. was established just as these concepts began to bear fruit within the ranks of politicians and young officers, facilitated not only by the German attacks on England, but also by the increasing capabilities of the Air Force, resulting in an Air Force that was dominated by a strategic bomber doctrine for decades to come. Now there was some merit to this. The capabilities of bombers had increased exponentially. Now bombers no longer carried small bomb loads of small bombs, but had a respectable amount and that of bigger bombs. Adding to this was that the bomb delivery system had improved, helping accuracy, and the fact that more and more modern bombers were available than before. While World War I machines were still largely dependent on the weather, the longer time went by, the less of an impact this had. During the interwar period, bombers had also surpassed fighter plane design. For some years, bombers could actually fly higher or at least faster than fighters, making them hard to intercept. Due to this, pretty much every major nation felt pressure to develop a supposedly invincible bomber force. Of course, with technological advances and the shift from bi- to monoplane fighters, the speed and altitude advantage of bombers was eventually for naught. During the interwar years, numerous attempts had been made to gain some sort of accord between nations to prevent the use of strategic bombers on civilians. We will not go into all of them. None of these attempts bore any fruit. Bombing indiscriminately was still seen as an assured way to shorten any future war while guaranteeing fewer friendly casualties. The principal argument was that by targeting non-combat elements, you would prevent these from contributing to the war industry, while also causing panic and protest versus the government. In 1921, the British Air Staff warned of strategic bombing against Britain and that the material damage inflicted will be great, but the moral effect will be more far-reaching still. The dislocation of national life and of the work of factories, the damage to centers of food supply, and the widespread fear of personal injury may force us to comply with the demands of the enemy without a single surface action being fought. In consequence, an offensive aerial deterrent was seen as central to British defense. Thus naturally the Royal Air Force had to be equipped with strategic bombers itself. Now there are those that stood against such a single-minded obsession with bombers, arguing that similarly how the German bombings had eventually caused a greater determination amongst the British people in 1917, so too would it be with any other nation. Even by 1917, Winston Churchill wrote that It is improbable that the terrorization of the civilian population, which could be achieved by air attack, would compel the government of a great nation to surrender. The problem was that there was no data that neither side of the argument could use to carry the day. The post-war reports made in Germany were ambiguous and contradictory in their nature. The increase in capabilities was also used as an argument, stating that while it might not have been possible to break a nation from the air in World War I, it might be in the future. Eventually the R.A.F. developed as a strategic bomber force, believing that the breaking of home front morale by air was to carry the day in any future war. Early campaigns in British-controlled colonies seemed to achieve this desired effect, although this was against people that had no real notion of air power to begin with, not against a great power. This caused a certain amount of isolationist thought, a bubble that prevented a breakage from the Trenchardian offensive doctrine. But there was also material reasons for such policy. As bombers were more expensive to maintain than fighters, a strategic bomber force was seen to be somewhat of a funding guarantee. As Biddle notes, so long as the central tenets of Trenchardian thought remained unchallenged externally, there was no incentive to question them, particularly since they served institutional interests very effectively. Now this was a very simplified account on how World War I prompted the formation of a strong British strategic bomber force and doctrine that would continue right into World War II. It's a massive topic that, if you find it interesting, you can delve into deeper with some of the sources put in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to support me on Patreon and to check out the Great Wars video. Now if you want to learn more on why strategic bombing is so complex, check out this video. And if you'd like to learn more about the United States Air Service during World War I, click right here. As always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.